Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sandy Buchanan, Executive Director of IEEFA, and we'd like to welcome both our in-person and our online audience to the third plenary of Energy Finance 2022, Green versus Blue Hydrogen, Market, Tech, and Cost Realities. Our moderator for this session will be Suzanne Mattei. Suzanne is an attorney and policy analyst with IEEFA. She has analyzed policies related to gas pipelines, blue hydrogen, petrochemicals, and gas flaring. Suzanne has worked in both the government and the nonprofit sectors, including as regional director of a state environmental permit agency in New York. Now let me turn this over to Suzanne to introduce our panel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. In this session, we're going to be talking about hydrogen gas made from water, which is called green hydrogen, if the energy driving the electrolysis is renewable. We're also going to discuss hydrogen gas made from methane, which I think pretty much everybody here will know is a powerful greenhouse gas. Methane is the primary component, of course, of natural gas. Hydrogen gas made from methane is called gray hydrogen, but if coupled with a carbon capture system, it's called blue hydrogen. But that term is used very sloppily because nobody seems to care how effective the carbon capture actually is before they start calling it blue. The oil and gas industry, mindful of the impacts of the energy transition on its market, has been working hard to promote the use of natural gas in hydrogen production. We saw this in the United States, in particular with the heavy lobbying around the two most recent major energy legislation pieces that came through. The problem, as we'll discuss, is that carbon capture does not solve the issue of greenhouse gas emissions from blue hydrogen production. The proposed US standard for clean hydrogen, which would make a project eligible for federal funding, supposedly, is based on an assumption that blue hydrogen will achieve consistently 95% carbon capture from the hydrogen process. But the Department of Energy has a nice little loophole that allows it to grant that money even if they don't meet that standard, if it decides that they're, working hard on it. So, wherever you are, your tax dollars, to the extent that they're used to support blue hydrogen, will not be supporting clean hydrogen. So let's talk. Dr. Robert Howarth is with us today. He's an Earth Systems scientist with a PhD from MIT and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He joined the faculty of Cornell University in 1985 and was appointed to the Atkinson Professor of Ecology position in 1993. Dr. Howarth conducted brilliant, groundbreaking analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions from blue hydrogen. He's stood up to aggressive pushback from the oil and gas industry. He's going to discuss his findings and also his compelling rebuttal to that pushback. And don't give me any argument about calling you brilliant, okay? Bruce Robertson is IEEFA's Stella expert in Australia. He's an investment analyst, fund manager, professional investor for over 36 years. This guy knows money. He's worked with Perpetual Trustees, UBS, Nippon Life Insurance, and BT. He's appeared as an expert witness in government inquiries into energy issues. He's going to present his analysis of carbon capture and storage in the context of blue hydrogen. And Bruce, don't give me any argument about calling you stellar. Arjun Flora is IEEFA's impressive director of energy finance studies in Europe. He analyzes a broad range of topics related to the energy transition there, including power utilities, gas infrastructure, blue and green hydrogen, renewable energy, energy markets, and sustainable finance. He's going to describe his analysis of how the hydrogen issue is playing out right now in Europe, which, as we know, is a major arena. And Arjun, don't give me any guff about calling you impressive. I'll close with a practical discussion of the limits of the hydrogen market overall and the limited market for blue hydrogen in particular. We're then going to invite questions. There'll be microphones in the aisle. Please use them so that people can hear you, give your name and where you're from before you give your question. And we'll alternate between the microphones, and fortunately, we will also be able to take some questions from online viewers for this session. So for our online audience, I'm going to read these instructions. Please use the chat function toward the bottom of the chat feature. Just click where it says, say something. Type your name, where you're from, your question, then press the send button to the right. You can only send up to 200 characters in one chat message. So let's get started. Dr. Howarth.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'm delighted to be here today with this important audience. Can we go to the first slide for my presentation, please? Do I do that? What happens if I hit next? Nothing. There you go. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to address this question: is blue hydrogen really clean? Suzanne's already told you it's not, and of course I agree, that's why I'm here, but let's find out why. Today, 96% of the hydrogen in North America and in Europe is coming from natural gas. That's been true for most of the last century. The process is an old one. It's called steam methane reforming. And the methane that is in natural gas is the feedstock for this process. Methane's put under high heat and pressure, a little bit of steam's added, and the methane breaks down into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. That heat and pressure is provided by also burning natural gas. So there's a lot of natural gas involved in this product, and it has high greenhouse gas emissions. Now, as Suzanne said, blue hydrogen is the same. We take methane, reform it with steam, and we produce the hydrogen. Only now the thought is you capture carbon dioxide. This is a new concept. It's really the invention of the oil and gas industry, starting with Air Liquide just 7 years ago. And it's been heavily promoted by the Hydrogen Council since about 2017, 2018. Hydrogen Council was set up by big oil and gas, BP, Shell, Total, precisely to sell this blue hydrogen concept. As of a year ago, there were only 2 attempts ever to try it and deal with this commercially in the world. Blue hydrogen is promoted by industry as being zero emissions or low emissions or carbon friendly. Is that true? And the answer is no, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that carbon dioxide capture is far from perfect, as Suzanne has said, and Bruce Robertson will go into more detail on that in a minute. Also, to date, in the 2 plants that have operated, industry has not even tried to capture the carbon dioxide from the combustion of the natural gas that fuels the whole process. They've concentrated just on that in the steam methane reforming process. And also, we have an additional problem. When you use natural gas, and natural gas is used here both as the feedstock and as the energy source, you can't develop and use natural gas without having some of the methane that is natural gas released to the atmosphere in unburned form. We call that fugitive upstream emissions. And methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It's more than 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. It's responsible for about 40% of all of the global warming that's occurred to date since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So it's important. And I'm going to concentrate on the methane side of the story today. So I just want to give you a little bit of sense of where the methane's coming from as we develop and use natural gas. And people talk about methane as leaking. Methane does leak. It's a leaky gas. But it's much more than that. A lot of it is emitted to the atmosphere as purposeful part of operations. And I'm just giving you some examples here. Let me just go to the final one down there, blowdowns for pipeline maintenance. What does that mean? It means that you don't go out and weld on a gas pipeline when it's full of methane. an explosion risk. So the standard industry practice is to take all of the gas that's in the pipeline and blow it off to the atmosphere before any maintenance. That's not a leak. That's a purposeful part of operations, and industry's not developed any other way to do maintenance. So we can't develop and use natural gas without some methane going to the atmosphere unburned. We have a pretty good sense of how much methane is being emitted, particularly in the United States right now. And I have a paper coming out that summarizes that in early December. We have about 20 top-down estimates. What top-down mean? It means people have flown over gas fields with airplanes making measurements of methane, or we use satellite data and inferred overall emission rates. There's variation in these, but they're hovering with a median estimate of about 3.7% of the gas being emitted. That's at the production site and the transportation, the processing and all. It doesn't include what goes on once you hit an urban distribution system, such as we have here in New York, which would be another 2.5% or so. But in terms of what's going to a blue hydrogen facility, 3.7% is a good estimate, very good estimate of what that might be. So let's look at the analysis that we did. This is a paper that Mark Jacobson of Stanford and I published a year ago in August. We asked the question, how green is blue hydrogen? This is one of the very few peer-reviewed analyses of greenhouse gas footprint of either gray or blue hydrogen. We looked at both. And it's the first to look at methane in an explicit sense whatsoever for either gray or blue hydrogen. Our paper is pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. We purposefully made it so and very transparent because we knew industry wouldn't like our story and we knew we'd get pushback, which we have. So I won't go through this in great detail, but one of the input estimates is what that emissions of methane is, and we used a 3.5% value for this. We did sensitivity analysis over a range of other reasonable estimates. You can compare methane to carbon dioxide at different time frames, and we used a 20-year time frame, which we think is most appropriate given the urgency of climate change and methane. And then we assumed that 85% of the CO2 is captured in the steam methane reforming process and less in the combustion fuel process. I'll go through that a little bit more. That slide's a mess, so I'm not going to use it. We'll go right to the chase here. This is the summary table figure out of our paper. And what I'm showing you is the direct and indirect carbon dioxide emissions in yellowish color there. And in red are the unburned methane emissions associated with using the natural gas behind these fuels and converted to carbon dioxide equivalencies. So on the left, you see gray hydrogen. It has a big footprint. Blue hydrogen has a lower carbon dioxide footprint, but not that much because they're not even trying to capture the carbon dioxide from the combustion process, and they're burning more fuel to power the carbon capture which occurs. The methane emissions from blue hydrogen are greater than for gray hydrogen because more natural gas is used. It takes more to power, again, the carbon dioxide capture. And both gray hydrogen and blue hydrogen have a greenhouse gas footprint that in fact is larger than if one were to simply burn natural gas or use other fossil fuels. So why are we doing this? It's got a big footprint. We also looked at what would happen if industry were to try and capture the carbon dioxide from the combustion process. And again, they haven't tried to do so to date, but the middle bar we're showing you there is what we estimate they could do if they wanted to. Carbon dioxide emissions go down, but they don't go to zero because carbon dioxide capture is imperfect. And the methane emissions go up because it requires even more natural gas to provide more energy for the greater carbon dioxide capture effort. We did a sensitivity analysis around our assumptions, and I'll just very quickly show you this. Here we're looking at different assumptions about methane emissions. So the top red circled area are the data I just showed you, our baseline assumptions. The next one down is what I've called the worst case for what we did. We say methane emissions could be greater than we said. We're using a 4.5% estimate here, 4.3. And it could be that the global warming potential, the capacity of methane to absorb radiation compared to CO2 could be worse than we assumed as well. So the situation could be worse than our baseline. Take-home message is the same. All of the numbers go up. Blue hydrogen is better than gray hydrogen, but still not that much, and it's still far worse than simply burning natural gas. And our best case scenario there is at the bottom. Here we use what I consider the lowest possible reasonable estimate for methane emissions, and we're comparing methane to carbon dioxide on a 100-year time period, which greatly underestimates the damage that methane does. But we still have a take-home message. All the numbers are lower as a result, but they all go down, including from natural gas. Blue hydrogen still isn't all that much better than gray hydrogen, and it's really comparable to natural gas. It is still no better than natural gas. Now, Suzanne mentioned that we got some pushback on this. We got a lot of pushback. Industry is very unhappy. We got a huge amount of pushback on social media beginning the day our paper was published, August 12th, 2021. I remember it well. And we answered it in Twitter and elsewhere, but people in industry kept saying there's going to be a powerful peer-reviewed report that just smashes your analysis. So it eventually came out. This is a paper that was published last March on comment. It had to be retracted and then pulled out again because originally the authors claimed they didn't have any conflicts of interest, and when people asked about that, it turns out, well, they did. These are their conflicts of interest. So this is the second version of the paper. They didn't change anything else. We wrote a reply, and I'll just very briefly go through what's in the reply. There are really two criticisms they leveled. One is that we weren't optimistic enough about how well carbon dioxide capture could work. And we used the actual data from the operating plants. But they said what we should have done is to use a theoretical analysis that they developed, pointing out how things could be much better than the industry's ever done before. And I'll let my colleague address that aspect. The other criticism is that we were simply wrong on methane emissions. And I thought that was puzzling because I've worked on methane emissions for 12, 15 years, and I'm the most cited author in the world on methane emissions from oil and gas. But anyway, they said I was wrong. So I want to go through a little bit in detail here. Suzanne encouraged me to do so. Here we're looking at the percent methane emitted from using natural gas. And that bottom line, this is the percentage of the gas that's produced. That star in the bottom line is our default value. The blue numbers are the numbers we used in the sensitivity analysis. And then the comment used three sources of information to say that we were using numbers which were way, way too high. So those red dots show two of their sources. One's a 2015 report out of the Sustainable Gas Institute. I think it's the first fine value. It's out of date. About half of the papers we used were published since then, and things have gotten worse since then in terms of what the data show. But I would say that dot is well within the range of what we see. The next one up is from the International Energy Agency in 2018, and again, it's at the low end of what we were assuming, but it's within the range. But there's a caveat, and that is that back in February of this year, the International Energy Agency put out a new report saying their 2018 number was too low by a factor of 1.7, and it really should be this, which the commenters ignored. So those are two of their sources, and I would contend that our methane numbers look pretty good relative to that range. They have one more number, which truly looks different, and that's the number there. And this one is, the source is from an industry website. And if you go to the industry website, that's it. It's a cartoon, has no references to any data, no information, no data. It's just simply asserts that methane emissions are 0.2%. And they use this to say that our analysis was fundamentally flawed. So I'm happy with what we did. I think a lot of people are embarrassed for having promoted on social media this incredible paper that was going to prove us wrong. I want to spend just, I have another minute, well, two and a half minutes I have. I want to just end by saying a little bit about green hydrogen and where that might be going. And I just want to point out, we'll hear a lot more from others in the panel in a minute. I want to point out that in the past, hydrogen has mostly been used as a chemical feedstock for making fertilizer and in the oil industry, et cetera, not generally as a fuel. There probably is a role for green hydrogen, the hydrogen made from electrolysis of water with 100% renewable electricity. although I think that has been oversold in some ways. But again, the industry started promoting this idea of blue hydrogen just starting back in 2017 or so. And starting last year, they deliberately tried to confuse both blue hydrogen and green hydrogen with this idea of clean hydrogen, which ends up in the bipartisan infrastructure, et cetera, language. And I want to, in particular, say that even for green hydrogen, I want to make sure that we don't use it to put into gas pipeline systems for heating of homes and commercial buildings. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but one, methane's a leaky gas. Hydrogen's a smaller molecule. It's the smallest molecule in the universe. It's far leakier, and it also contributes to global warming. So you put into pipelines, it's going to leak. And in fact, when you put into pipelines, because it has a lower energy density, you need to increase the pressure of the pipeline, so methane emissions are going to increase as well. The gas pipeline systems we have are not built to handle any substantial amount of hydrogen. People talk about maybe blending 5% up to 20% hydrogen into methane pipeline systems. The California Air Resources Board this summer issued a report saying probably we should not be putting in more than 5% because it's dangerous. Fundamentally, though, I also want to point out that if you're taking renewable electricity to make hydrogen and then putting it into a pipeline to heat homes, it's extremely inefficient. If you instead take the same amount of electricity and take it to the home and use a high efficiency heat pump for heating, you're generating at least 6 times and maybe up to 10 times more heat energy for the same amount of renewable electricity. So safety issues aside, using green hydrogen for heating is just a really, really poor idea. And I will end with that. Thank you.
So I'm here today to talk to you about carbon capture and storage for blue hydrogen with a bit of a question mark. Look, we just completed a study of 13 carbon capture and storage projects globally that covered 55% of the emissions on the globe of carbon dioxide. Yeah, and we came to the conclusion that basically three of those projects had pretty much totally failed or terminated very early. 3 of the projects had achieved what they set out to achieve, and 7 had underperformed, quite often by margins of up to 50%. I think it's also really important when you look at carbon capture and storage that you just go back in history a little bit and look at the history, because it's an old industry. And it's sold to you as a new industry. It's not, it's an old industry. It's been operating at commercial scale since the 1970s. So that's some 50 years ago. It was started out, and it started out being called enhanced oil recovery. And that's really what it was. It's an oil production technique. When you produce natural gas, you have to split off the carbon dioxide as part of the production process. And this happens every time you produce gas. You split off the carbon dioxide. And it used to get vented to the air, and the smarties in the industry thought, well, why don't we use that and put it down depleted old oil and gas wells to force the last oil and gas out of those wells. So when you hear carbon capture and storage, don't think it's something to do with green or being nice to the environment. It's about producing more oil and gas. So it's about 300 million tonnes of carbon dioxide has been captured by the CCS industry in its 50-year history. And approximately 3/4 of all projects in existence today are in fact enhanced oil recovery projects. Only 10 to 20% of the projects have actually stored carbon dioxide in dedicated storages. And the numbers are always a bit rubbery with carbon capture and storage. I'll put that caveat on everything, and they're rubbery because it underperforms so radically that if you look at the capacity numbers and then what's the real truth, they're always two different things. So that's why the numbers do vary. If we have a look, it is used mainly in natural gas processing, about 70% of the total operational capacity worldwide. And we've seen a number of those projects here on the screen. We've got Chute Creek is an enhanced oil recovery. Its lifetime underperformance is around 36% compared to its capacity to capture carbon dioxide. Gorgon in Australia is a new project. It's only 5 years old. It's the largest one on the globe that actually captures carbon and stores it in a dedicated facility. And it was done by Chevron. The other major shareholders in the project are Shell and ExxonMobil, and you could argue that it's pretty much got some of the best petroleum engineers on the globe working on it, and they can't get it to work. They simply can't get it to work. And it's underperforming its capture targets by about 50%. There are two in Norway that have performed pretty well, which is Sleipner and Snøhvit. They're by Equinor. The same company had a project in Algeria called Insalar, which failed and was suspended in 2011. So even for the people that have got it kind of right, it's a very problematic technology. Here are some of the projects that we've just kind of gone through, so we won't go on about that. On the industrial side, it's pretty interesting because, you've got really, it's about 25% of the total operating capacity worldwide is used for industry. And the results have been very patchy again. There's only one project there that you can get reasonable data on, and that's the Quest project in Canada that has performed close to its design capture performance. And the others there, look, the underperformance ranges from 20 to 50%. So basically the numbers that first come out are pretty much wrong. I think it's really interesting if you have a look at the Quest project in Canada. It was hugely government subsidised to the tune of $95 Canadian a tonne for every tonne of carbon dioxide it captures. But it only aims to capture 35% of the carbon dioxide that comes out of the oil upgrader. So it's only aiming to capture 35% of the emissions. And, that's really not great considering it's on a tar sands project. Again, in the power sector, it's littered with failures. Boundary Dam underperforms by about 50%. Now, that figure has been disputed by SAS Power, and I scratched my head because I was using all their numbers and I was going, gee, what have I done wrong here? And then I realised, oh, that's right, I did read that somewhere. They changed their targets. So if ever you see a higher number for Boundary Dam, just remember that, anyone can get a higher number, you just change the target. Petronova in the US failed and was not mothballed in 2020, and Kemper coal gasification that David Schnitzel wrote about extensively failed and closed in 2017. That was a financial disaster, Kemper. So look, in summary, it's a very, very energy intensive process. According to the Quest annual data, 21% of all the emissions they saved were actually used up in doing the carbon capture and storage process itself. So when they quote a number, that's the headline number, it's not a net number, okay? It's not net of the emissions to actually do the process. And this is another nice little statistical thing that they manipulate. That's 5.38 million tonnes of carbon dioxide was offset by the emitted CO2 in the capturing process. So it's a considerable number, 21% of the total emissions. Yeah. So why is it so energy intensive? Well, you've got to actually capture the carbon, then you've got to compress it, to a very high degree and force it underground. And it uses a lot of energy in that process. Also, the plants are extraordinarily expensive because they use a lot of steel and a lot of engineering. And so there's a lot of embodied carbon in the plants themselves. And that is unaccounted for as well. So when we look at, we're going to try and put this into blue hydrogen, you sit there going, okay, so they have trouble capturing it off the stream, off whatever process we're talking about, particularly with the industrial processes, they've had trouble actually capturing it. And then we have trouble putting it underground. And then when we do put it underground, most of it is used to make more oil and gas, which then produces more emissions. And so you end up with this conclusion that carbon capture and storage is not an emissions reduction technique, it's an emissions production technique. And this is the key point about carbon capture and storage, when you start really looking at it, is that most of it is used to produce more oil and gas and hence more emissions, not less emissions. And it's a very fundamental thing we've got to get to with the Paris Accord, is that we are trying to produce less emissions. Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name's Arjun and I've been asked to speak about hydrogen in Europe today. This is a huge topic, so I'm going to do my best just to give a quick overview of the situation in Europe. Okay, so I'm going to start just by mentioning the European Green Deal, because this is something that makes it quite different from other regions. So back at the end of 2019, this was announced by the EU, and this is a set of policies which really look at steering the continent towards being the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And a really important point here is that this is a legally binding target, objective under the European climate law. One of the things it talks about is seeking to decouple economic growth from resource use, which is one of the major global challenges, I think, going forwards. But interestingly, hydrogen was mentioned in this announcement, but only a few times. And every time it was mentioned, it was alongside other important technologies such as smart grids, batteries, CCS, funnily enough, and also other alternative solutions as a kind of broad catch-all for technologies which haven't yet been developed. And what we see is that there's been quite a change in rhetoric over the last few years, as Professor pointed out. So a year after that, we heard the EU's hydrogen strategy. So this was launched, I think, halfway through 2020. And a few points about that. It focuses on green hydrogen or renewable hydrogen. But this is as much about an economic opportunity for the future, about driving sustainable economic growth, sustainable perhaps in quotation marks, as much as it is about decarbonization of our economy. So this included production targets, 2024, 6 gigawatts, and in 2030, 40 gigawatts and initially 10 million, so initially it was 5 million tons of domestic production of green hydrogen. So this means electrolyzer capacity, effectively, being powered by renewables. Then in May this year, following the invasion of Ukraine, the EU announced the Repower EU set of policies, which is all about how to get off Russian fossil fuels. So as part of this, they also increased the target now for green hydrogen, effectively doubling the target. And then more recently, just only a month ago in her State of Union address, President Ursula von der Leyen announced a European hydrogen bank, which would provide up to 3 billion euros to help support the creation of this hydrogen economy. Details are still unclear on that bank. So what's the problem with green hydrogen? Is there even a problem? Perhaps not if it's produced in the right way and used for the right applications. One major issue is the potential cannibalization of renewable power capacity. Because it relies on renewable power, we in the EU are already behind our targets for deploying solar and wind. So there's a real risk of putting that into competition with green hydrogen production. Then another major risk, which should really be actually pulled out from those bullet points at the bottom, is cost and affordability. And if you look ahead at projections of costs, they all show industry projections of reducing costs out to 2040, but currently it's really not cost effective. So here's a quote from that recent speech a month ago. I'll just read some of it. Hydrogen can be a game changer for Europe. We need to move our hydrogen economy from niche to scale. This is how we power the economy of the future. This is the European Green Deal. So these are some really bold statements and very different to what we heard at the end of 2019. So the question I'd like to ask today is, where did this come from? So that's what I'll explore now. If we go back to 2019, here's a report that was published by Hydrogen Europe with help from McKinsey, and also input from 17 companies, which I've listed there on the slide. First page, executive summary vision. Hydrogen is required for Europe's energy transition. So it's no longer just a small part, suddenly it's a major requirement. And the other part which was circled basically says, if we don't have hydrogen, the EU will miss its climate objective. Also in this report is a projection for hydrogen demand. And just to explain this chart a bit, the bar on the left-hand side shows hydrogen demand in 2015. Then the next two bars show projections for 2030. On the left is a business as usual case. On the right is an ambitious scenario, which is what this report is pressing for. Then on the right are two more bars. Again, business as usual and ambitious, this time for 2050. Now, as you can see, there's a massive difference there between those two scenarios. And in terms of the sectors, we've already heard how some sectors really don't make sense, to be using hydrogen. And so the green and dark blue there is actually heating and power for buildings and transportation. So this report was speaking about 4 million light vehicles, cars effectively, being powered by hydrogen fuel cells, which we can see now is really not a realistic projection. But the key point here is that this report is really demanding that this ambitious scenario is what's needed for the EU to meet its climate objectives. And just an example of some of this language, acting now, regulators, industry, and investors must launch the EU's hydrogen roadmap together. And what are they offering? Well, they're offering decarbonisation, but also this market opportunities I mentioned. So 820 billion euros. To put that in context, the annual revenue from today's automobile industry in the EU is about 900 billion euros, and that has about 2.5 million jobs. So you can see that they're really putting it comparable to that, which is a really massive, significant industry for the region. So that was in 2019, excuse me. That was in 2019. Then in March this year, Hydrogen Europe published another report. The organization has grown hugely. You can see it accounts now over 400 members, 25 regions. So massive momentum over the last few years, but still the same themes. Firstly, demands for certain targets and legislation effectively, and also this claim that hydrogen can decarbonize energy use in all sectors, and that's why we need to go big for hydrogen. And so in this particular case, they were talking again about doubling the production targets for green hydrogen. Now, in both of these cases, they've got what they wanted effectively. I mean, the timing of those reports, effectively what the different targets that they were advocating for have all found their way through to policy today. One of the fundamental themes running through this is that Europe can use its gas infrastructure to transport and store hydrogen. And so I've put a map there. The orange lines show the future hydrogen backbone, which is being proposed, and the other lines show today's existing natural gas pipelines in Europe. Now, I want to speak about this a bit because I feel like this is really the crux of where this aggressive push has come from in Europe. Some of you may have seen this documentary, perhaps a show of hands. How many have seen this documentary? Okay, a few, okay. So Big Oil versus the World, I recommend everybody watch it. It's 3 episodes. But the first part is about Exxon in the 70s, how they found out about climate change, realized that it posed an existential threat to their business model, and so decided that they were going to bury it and use that as an information advantage in the future. I feel like this situation is really quite analogous to what we see today in Europe. So I'd like to introduce this group of companies, the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Gas, also known as ENTSOG or ENTSOG. So this is a group of nationally regulated private monopolies. They have huge influence and political ties. They own and are responsible for planning and building gas infrastructure across the EU. Most importantly, they receive guaranteed returns on their investments effectively for building infrastructure. So there's a massive conflict of interest here because these are also the same companies which are tasked with planning the energy system. So how were they incentivized? Well, this may have worked in the past when Europe was needing to build out gas infrastructure, but you can see, because they get these guaranteed returns, they're effectively looking all the time to justify additional investment. So more pipelines, more LNG terminals, more storage facilities. And through that, they can generate more dividends for shareholders. And this is their key pitch to investors, is we offer stable and growing shareholder dividends. So what that means is we have this conflict of interest, and that's created a couple of results. Firstly, a massive overbuild of infrastructure, which, by the way, is why in Spain there are lots of LNG terminals that haven't been used. And there are other good examples which please refer to some IEEFA reports that we've produced. But the second result is lobbying. So lobbying behind the scenes against strict climate regulations and against any policies which can be harmful. But one of the main points, again, is about this repurposing of gas infrastructure, in this case for hydrogen. And I believe this is really where the big push has come from in Europe, because this is the existential threat that I was talking about that Big Oil was seeing. If we know in Europe that there's going to be no gas demand or it's going to be phased down by 2050, what do these companies do? They're not going to exist in the same way. So the only way that they can is if they can shift their business model into hydrogen and thereby continue to justify increased and continued investments. And so far they're winning. So at the end of last year, and this is one of the campaign fights, which unfortunately didn't go so well perhaps, is that it's now policy that there's going to be a new association created, which looks very similar to the Gas Association, and it's going to be the same companies, but this time in charge of the hydrogen infrastructure. Okay, so I'm running a bit low on time, but I just quickly want to talk about blue hydrogen in the UK. So the UK is different. So what I've been saying there was all about the EU, green hydrogen. The UK is still supporting both blue and green hydrogen. So earlier this year, there was a new British energy security strategy, which set a target of 10 gigawatts of production capacity, but importantly, it was left flexible, with up to 5 gigawatts of that could be blue hydrogen. So earlier this year, we produced a report showing that, hang on, we're in a gas price crisis. What is blue hydrogen? It's using gas to make a more expensive version. And so the chart on the right there is taken from our report. The gray part of the bars is gas cost. And so the two bars on the left showed two scenarios that were produced by BEIS, the government department, and the bar on the right is our adjusted cost given today's gas prices. And you can see that even the high price scenario now has been completely blown out of the water, and that was looking ahead to 2035. So really there's no economic case anymore for blue hydrogen. If you remember why blue hydrogen was being proposed in the first place, it was really as a low cost bridge or transition until green hydrogen is cheap enough. And really that argument doesn't stand up anymore. Secondly, we also did a piece of research just looking at the overall decarbonisation pathway of the UK, and just pointed out that the current baseline scenario being proposed by the Climate Change Committee, which is the government advisor, is actually still projecting significant blue hydrogen production in 2050, a third of gas demand in 2050 for blue hydrogen, which now we can see really doesn't make any sense. So hopefully there'll be a new announcement about that later in the month. And lastly, I mean, some of you may have heard about the political turmoil at the moment in the UK. So this was a real facepalm moment, if I've ever had one. So there was a really good review published recently by Dr. Jan Rosenhauer, the Regulatory Assistance Project. And that looked at 32 independent studies, independent meaning not funded by the oil and gas industry, and none of them provided evidence that hydrogen for heating, particularly in homes, is a good idea. Despite this, our most recent Energy Secretary came out with that quote you can see on the screen. I think hydrogen is ultimately the silver bullet. It can be piped through to people's houses to heat them during the winter. So yeah, I have a few words. So looking ahead, okay, I'm trying to bring it back to issues today. I'll come back to that slide actually. So there are a whole host of different issues which are active. And I think that's what I really want to try and get across here, is that this is not happening of its own accord. It's an ongoing debate and it can be influenced. So one of the big things is about decarbonizing the existing grey hydrogen market. I think that always has to be put as a priority, and often that gets pushed to the side by the industry. Blue hydrogen, I mentioned the UK, hydrogen for heating. Hydrogen blending is another one, which is the concept of putting some hydrogen into the broader natural gas network, and also the gas package, which is about legislation. But I wanted to mention this because last week there was a big hydrogen conference in Rotterdam, and Michael Liebreich was the opening speaker. And you may remember he was the keynote speaker of last year's IEEFA conference, which was held virtually. And he hasn't always agreed, with IEEFA's view in terms of blue hydrogen, for example. But he came out with, and I quote, "Hydrogen is starting to look like an economic bubble. And here's why." And he goes on to say that potential uses of hydrogen, which are being pushed, are in direct competition with electric alternatives that tend to be cheaper and easier. So on that note, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll wait for my slide presentation to come up. And I'm going to be talking about markets, and I think I'll just hit some high points because I think people are going to have some additional commentary and questions, and so I want to make sure we accommodate that. There we go. Okay. Weak commercial prospects for blue hydrogen. You already know about all this stuff. Pay attention to the deadlines that will be coming up for those of you in the United States applying for the federal dollars, November and April of next year. There's going to be federal dollars, but it's not enough to build these things. These people who want to promote these facilities, they're going to be coming hat in hand to states and local governments. They're going to want grants, they're going to want tax incentives, and states should consider whether they want to invest their limited economic development dollars on something that has weak prospects, something that is not really a job-generating business with real staying power, which is what they should be investing in. Time's not on blue hydrogen's side, okay? By the time blue hydrogen is up and running, everything else is way ahead of them. And here's the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Lab, which promotes green and blue hydrogen both. And they're saying, well, yeah, you know, the potential market for hydrogen is 106 million metric tons, per year. And that's in comparison to the existing use, which is about 11 million. But then they say, oh, but then we have to consider competition. And when you look at the competition and the economics, the next two bars there are a lot lower. If they're being really wishful, they can get up to 44, but if they're more realistic, they get down to 22. So they're only talking about doubling the existing production of hydrogen. It's not a lot. And we think it's going to be even less than that because we think the competition is going to continue to be fierce. Late to the party, competitive laggard. Behind in the power sector, wind and solar are already almost 2/3 of new capacity being added. That's this year, that's 2022. It's not going to own the road. If you look at what's happening with the cars and even with small trucks, and I don't know what's going to happen with larger trucks, but blue hydrogen is just, it's not happening right now. And if you look at, well, let me go back for just a second there. If you look at fueling stations, you can't even see the hydrogen line because the electric fuel stations are so numerous that when you do a chart, hydrogen is like, they've got 54 fueling stations in the United States, and 53 of them are in California, and the other one's in Hawaii. We're not talking about market penetration here, all right? And the same thing is true with vehicle sales, and these are the vehicle sales for new cars, light-duty vehicles, in September of 2022. And you can see people are buying electric, they're buying hybrid, but what is the number there? 34, is that what that says? For hydrogen, so small. We're going to see a possible increase in heavy-duty truck use of fuel cells, but most experts are seeing that not really moving along well until later in the 2020s. And by then, electric vehicles are already starting to chew their way into the truck market. So there's not a lot there. There's not a lot of there. If you look at air travel as another niche market, the International Panel on Climate Change says, you know, biofuels are going to do better than hydrogen, and it's just going to cut into it by quite a bit. With ships, you can't even look at the fuel number right now for ships because ships have not been economizing. They have not been doing energy efficiency. And Bloomberg NEF said, you know, they're going to be able to cut about 2/3 of their ship emissions just through efficiency measures. And then the rest of it, you know, maybe some hydrogen in the form of ammonia. But again, you're going to have biofuels. And all the way through, even with industrial feedstock, blue hydrogen has to compete with green hydrogen. So it's not a positive market situation. And green hydrogen is a lot simpler. You don't have to pay for all the stuff that you have to add in order to have the blue hydrogen, the equipment, the pressurization, the infrastructure to transport it and to sequester it. So you don't have to worry about upstate fugitive emissions. You don't have to worry about pipeline emissions. It's got less risk, and that's going to make it more attractive to investors and to businesses that are customers. So what does this mean for jobs in blue hydrogen? Should states be putting their economic dollars into this? You know, it's not likely to be a growing jobs engine. It's more likely that you're going to see the market shrink over time. And if you rush ahead now and try to build stuff fast when the market is not going to be there, then what are you going to see? You're going to see a diminishing jobs, employment trajectory, and you may even see some abandoned infrastructure. And I just threw this in here because we looked at jobs in Texas. Trey Cowan from our office did, and everybody believes Texas is oil country and oil is running the economy. It's not. If you look at the jobs from oil and gas, that's the lower line, the blue line. The rest of the economy is going up. Oil and gas is going down. So making really vigorous inquiries into assertions about jobs is really important because the facts are not necessarily what common perception is. And the investors are weary. The Global CSS Institute itself admits that it's hard to get funding for these projects. They were recommending that governments should force investors to invest in these projects. Just today, Moody's put out a report which said that basically that blue hydrogen is going to be bad for your long-term credit rating, and they're not all that excited about green hydrogen either. So if all these people are wary, states should be wary too. And it's really important to demand that they get all of the information, that they get accurate emissions data, that they get comprehensive assessment of costs, and a realistic and vigorous analysis of what the market is really going to be. So that's basically a whirlwind sketch of markets for hydrogen. And we're going to start some question and answer, so there'll be microphones coming down the aisle for people to stand in line and talk. And Vivian, you have a question from online? Okay, terrific.
I do.
Okay, do you think you can go ahead and give it to me while they're bringing
Sure.
the microphones down?
This is from Kathy Kowalski at Energy News Network in Ohio. Some groups are proposing a blue hydrogen as a way to bring more jobs to counties with high natural gas production. Are there any substantial job prospects beyond construction?
You know, again, they need to diversify their economies because fossil fuels are not the future. And blue hydrogen doesn't have a great market. There may be a few sectors where they're going to be able to get a few industries in, industrial uses most likely, but it's going to be hard to make these businesses fly over time. So they might do better going with a technology that has a real future. Yes. Oh, and let me ask Tom Sanzillo, would you tell us what you think is the significance of Moody's coming out with a statement today about long-term credit ratings relationship to blue hydrogen and hydrogen generally?
Yeah, just pretty quickly. A number of years ago, when the Sierra Club and a number of other organizations started to campaign around coal plants, we went to Moody's and Standard & Poor's. And they initially said that we didn't know what we were talking about, and they gave them all a high rating just when they were announced. So you announce the coal plant, you get a rating upgrade. We kept coming back as each coal plant failed, and still nothing. 20 coal plants failed, they still were keeping with the credit ratings. It took about 6 years before they said anything bad about coal, and now these days, if you own a coal plant, it's considered credit negative. But it took about 12 or 15 years. The campaigning and the work that's been going on around blue hydrogen and the research has been going on for less than a year. And now Moody's has come out and said, this is a bad idea for your investments. That's a very big change in how the impact that we all have been having with the work that the campaigning work and the research work is having an impact in the investment houses in ways that I never thought possible. This was a pretty big statement on their part.
That's great to know, and that's a great piece of information to bring to the states that are considering using your tax dollars to invest in this technology. Yes?
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Marcel. I'm coming from Hungary. I especially liked the idea that you have presented that hydrogen is not a silver bullet. I really agree with that. And I just wanted to ask regarding hydrogen storage. There is some opinion around that the variation in supply and demand does not match sometimes, and that's why storage could be necessary, but many storage technologies are at a really early stage and seem very expensive. I'm interested in your opinion, whether you think hydrogen storage is something that is needed, and if yes, do you see any technologies that may be commercially viable in the mid to long-term future? Thank you.
Let me, is this on? Let me take a crack at that. We clearly need a lot of energy storage moving forward into our renewable future to deal with the intermittency of solar and wind. And hydrogen certainly, green hydrogen certainly represents one pathway forward. It's competing with battery storage. It's competing with many other technologies, including compressed air, liquefied air. I think it's an open question now whether or not hydrogen will be the most effective in terms of either cost or environmentally. I have an open mind on that. I will say, though, that even green hydrogen has a greenhouse gas consequence if it leaks to the environment. And it's a very, very small molecule. It's hard to hold on to it. So it's not itself a greenhouse gas, but when we put hydrogen into the atmosphere, it prolongs methane in the atmosphere, it puts more water vapor in the stratosphere, it prolongs other greenhouse gases. And so if we're going to use it, we have to be very, very careful in how we use it. It's a leaky thing. Some of you may remember that NASA was trying to send off another satellite a month or so ago. It had to get postponed because of fueling problems, et cetera. Those fueling problems were hydrogen leaks. You've got some of the best engineers in the world at NASA, and they have a really hard time holding on to hydrogen. It's just a slippery molecule.
Could I just add to what Robert Howarth said, that there are a couple of unique features about hydrogen that we really have to understand the economics. And the first feature is that it's a really small molecule, and as Professor Howarth pointed out in his presentation, it doesn't have the same energy density as gas. So you need more volume to get the same amount of energy. So that's the first problem. The second unique problem you have with hydrogen is it embrittles steel. It makes steel brittle. So traditional gas infrastructure is quite often not suitable for hydrogen, any hydrogen. And the third problem you have is when you liquefy hydrogen for storage, which they are already doing, so they are actually getting on top of some of these problems, but as a pure cost thing, you have to reduce hydrogen. To make liquefied natural gas, you reduce the gas down to minus 140, and for hydrogen, that's 250 degrees. minus 250 degrees Celsius. So producing LNG is a very energy intensive process. You burn 9% of the gas just to produce LNG, and hydrogen will be much worse, is what I'm saying. You'll need a lot more energy to get it much colder. And so these are things that are, I'm not saying any of these are insurmountable problems and hydrogen's finished because of this, but they are definitely things to consider when you hear people talk about hydrogen as the silver bullet. There are a lot of engineering challenges to overcome before we get to that stage.
Thanks. If I could just add something as well. When we're talking about energy storage, I assume you're talking about, for example, converting electricity to hydrogen, which can then be burnt in a hydrogen power plant or in a fuel cell to produce electricity again when there's a need for it. And just one thing I'd say is to think about round trip efficiencies. So these technologies that hydrogen would be competing against have much higher efficiencies. So whether it's pumped hydro, kind of 70, 80%, whether it's batteries, 80, 90+%, hydrogen's kind of down at around 30% round trip efficiency. So it's not efficient. Perhaps it could be used for longer duration where batteries can't play, but then there are also other technologies like flow batteries, and I mentioned pumped hydro. So it's by no means, as you said, a silver bullet the way that it's sometimes portrayed to be.
I think I would add that it's important to question the assumptions about the level of intermittency that might really be needed, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Solar power doesn't need warm weather, it just needs sun. And you can have sun on cold days. And there's really no such thing as a no-wind day. There are light wind days. I learned that from a meteorologist. And so for example, during the most recent heat wave in Texas, the wind energy was still producing during extremely, extremely hot weather. So it's important to really drill down into the numbers. What kind of need are we really talking about? And if they start talking about peak power, like, spikes for extreme cold or extreme heat, then you can talk about demand management and grid management, how you move the energy. Having industries halt processes on particularly bad days. There's a lot that can be done to manage those spikes. Okay, do we have a question over here?
Hi everyone, Sarah Lutz from Friends of the Earth US. You've alluded to it a bit, but there's been a lot of hype about a hydrogen economy, with a number of industries trying to manifest new markets and uses for hydrogen. A piece of this has been messaging and promotion of LNG terminals as hydrogen ready. Given the technical limitations with transporting and storing hydrogen or hydrogen and methane blends, it seems that this is a bait and switch to justify further investment in gas capacity and infrastructure. But does this panel see a real risk of a hydrogen exports market?
I think you describe it exactly correctly when you say bait and switch. The industry has good engineers and they have good economists, and they must realize the sorts of things that we've been saying and the limitations. But as long as we keep talking about the possibility of a hydrogen future, it keeps the existing fossil gas industry going and alive, and the pipe infrastructure systems and the LNG systems with it. I think that is what's going on.
Yeah, look, I suppose I'd like to give you a real life example of a bait and switch, which was the Kurri Kurri gas-fired power station, not far from where I live, actually. It was proposed this gas-fired power station was going to be hydrogen ready to the tune of 30% on the first day it operated. And so the company got approval to build it. It then built all the infrastructure surrounding the plant, including a pipe to supply the plant that was a piece of $250 million infrastructure. It wasn't a small piece of infrastructure, and it was 100% hydrogen incompatible. So from day one, it's going to run on gas, and probably will run on, 30 years later be on gas as well. So the bait and switch is alive. today, and it is actually being done today. It's not a theoretical concept. There's real life examples of it, and you know, we do have to be very, very careful when they say, "Oh, we're going to blend in hydrogen," and the key point is, you know, when you put in 20% hydrogen, I think the figure you had was 7%, wasn't it?
Yeah.
7% energy value. So you end up with very little energy going in for a seemingly large amount of hydrogen is what I'm saying, you know, like, so you end up with really not a lot of gain in terms of reduction in emissions because the energy density of hydrogen is so low.
There's a new report that just came out a week or so ago from the Long Island Power Authority and the Electric Power Research Institute, and they look at the greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions from various plants. And they point out it's a nonlinear function, so you need to get up to about 70 to 80% hydrogen with 20 to 30% methane before you actually get a substantial reduction in CO2 emissions of more than 15% or so. So the industry's talking about this 5, 10, 20% that's problematic. It's meaningless in terms of reducing emissions, even if the hydrogen's really green. So it is bait and switch.
Yeah. I want to get this question here.
Hi, Stephen Feit from the Center for International Environmental Law. In seeing how policymakers have pursued this hydrogen and CCS agenda, and seeing how the industry is continuously talking about how there's new techniques. Oh, well, we're going to do really, I forget what they call it, really advanced carbon capture, where they'll capture 98 or 99%, or we'll do methane pyrolysis rather than steam methane reforming. Is your sense that the policymakers who are pursuing this agenda are just ill-informed, or are buying the company lines, or are just techno-optimistic, or what is driving this pursuit, given the kind of clear realities of the math not adding up?
You know, I think that a lot of legislators believe that businesses know what they're talking about. And even when they're patently wrong. So I think, you know, moving the correct information out there, getting directly to the decision makers and doing it as quickly as you can, because it's very hard to undo a thought that is in somebody's brain. It is really hard when they think this company, well, it's their business, they know. Well, so yeah, it's a lot of work to counter that, and there's a lot of money going into it, but they're not necessarily going to win. Was there a question that you had? I'm sorry. Don't run away.
No, that wasn't running away. It's related to the question that was just asked, so that's why I was giving someone else another chance. But I'm Kelsey Worth. I'm with the Winslow Foundation and Mothers Out Front. And along the same lines, I mean, you make such a clear scientific and economic rationale for why this stuff just shouldn't get built, but it seems like we build a lot of dumb stuff all the time. And I guess I'm wondering what, you know, how confident are you that it's not going to get, like, where are you on sort of how much risk are we facing here? And what can people here in this audience, given all the different organizations and institutions we come from, what can we be doing to help counter this sort of momentum that they apparently seem to have?
Well, first, let me admit that I'm old. And when I was in college, we were fighting a plan to build nuclear power plants all over the United States. And they had a map with little red dots where they were going to put all these nuclear power plants, and the country clearly had the measles. But only a few of them, a small fraction of them actually got built. I mean, you think that there are a lot of nuclear power plants, but compared to what they were planning to build, and people stopped them, and it started with people just, you know, fighting back and making the environmental arguments, but they got better and better at making the economic arguments. And, the reality is, if you're getting your energy from a nuclear power plant, you're paying high rates. I think the money is going to talk. I think it's already talking. And that's why wind and solar are making so much progress now. That's why many utilities have skipped the notion of going from coal to natural gas and then to wind or solar. They're skipping the bridge and they're going straight to wind and solar. And it's very much economically driven. But remember the Texas map. People think one thing is economically true, and it takes a lot of effort to get people to look at the real numbers and see what the economic truth is. So it's work. It really comes down to work. We just have to work a lot harder. So that's kind of where it goes. Let's see. Vivian, you want someone from online, and then we have the person at the...
We might be running out of time, but
Okay.
there are like 3 questions now online. Should I just give you all 3 and you pick one?
Why don't you give me the first one?
So
I also
this
want
is
to get the person
probably for
standing
Bruce.
behind.
It's a project in Australia that was supposed to burn a mix of hydrogen up to 30% and methane, has not been able to get the turbines to work. Apparently, no one can come close to burning 100% H2 in turbines. Do you know what the challenges are for this? Seems even less likely than carbon capture based on current results.
The turbines itself at the Kurri Kurri gas plant, this is a Kurri, I'm sure this is a Kurri Kurri gas plant that they're talking about. Well, pretty sure. The turbines themselves can burn hydrogen with some conversion, some money spent on them. But the problem lies in all the gas infrastructure of that particular plant, and it'll never burn hydrogen. So the whole thing's, the bait and switch, which I talked about earlier, and that's the issue. Is that the turbines themselves can be converted according to Mitsubishi, who built them, can be converted at some cost, but not the infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. One more question standing.
Luke Salford, Sustainable Ohio Public Energy Council. One thing you guys touched on, but I'd like to hear you expand on a little bit, is considerations around water, both from a scarcity standpoint and from environmental quality, things we should be aware of.
Anyone want to address that?
I'm not quite sure what to say, to be honest. I mean, I'm an oceanographer by training, so I'd like to have a water answer, but I've been focusing on the greenhouse gas consequences. Clearly, in terms of green hydrogen, we're electrolyzing water, and there's an issue there. It's difficult to do that in areas where water is scarce, but it's a relatively small amount of water compared to, say, what's used for fossil fuel extraction, et cetera. And they're developing technologies for using salt water as well. It's less efficient so far, but that technology is coming along. So we should always pay attention to water, but that wouldn't be my major concern at the moment.
Let's see if we have another moment for an online question, Vivian.
This is from Eric Kasongo. He's an attorney from Kinshasa in the Republic of the Congo. He asks, is it true that just like gold in the 18th century, green hydrogen is the new El Dorado in the energy sector, and that it'll transform economies? And also, is hydrogen from hydroelectricity by electrolysis clean, as some claim?
Well, I suppose really it depends on, hydroelectric schemes are not very green, as we all know. They interrupt river flows and create tremendous problems. But in certain cases where the damage has already been done and you have a second lower dam and you're doing a pumped hydro scheme, the environmental impact is relatively low where you've already done the damage. So it really does depend on the case. New big dams obviously are not a great idea if you're talking about the environment. But where there's an existing dam, putting one below it, I don't really see that it does too much damage, but that's just a personal opinion rather than anything else.
Yeah, but I mean, on the same issue, I think you need to ask also, why is hydrogen needed there? And if it's being used for energy storage, then wouldn't it be better to convert to some kind of pumped hydro if there's already a dam there? So yeah, it really comes back to the situation.
Going to try to squeeze in one last question, standing.
Thank you. My name is Bill Kish. I'm with TIA Divest from Climate Destruction. And I wanted to get the panel's opinion on what I think is a new flavor of bait and switch that is being proposed in a community near where I live, which is that a company is proposing to build what they're calling a green hydrogen facility, but instead of using a dedicated solar or wind field to produce the power, they're going to use grid power. And they claim that they're going to source it from renewable sources. What's interesting about it is that it has no regeneration capacity or storage capacity. They're going to inject the hydrogen directly into the Iroquois pipeline, which serves New York, and just upstream from a methane power plant, which has recently been making noises about burning 10% hydrogen. So it seems to me like they're trying to invent a perpetual motion machine and be able to claim that this suddenly turns the methane plant into something renewable. Have you heard of anything like this before? Anything that I can bring back to the people in that community?
I think you have it exactly right. It's a perpetual motion machine that they're talking about here. Burning 10% hydrogen mixed with methane in those gas plants is almost meaningless in terms of reducing the CO2 emissions, and the whole idea of buying grid certified renewable electricity is a little problematic. I mean, if you have no other choice, I do it at my home when I need power in addition to solar cells, but I always wonder if it's really green, right? It's hard to know. To the extent we're going to produce green hydrogen from renewable electricity, I think it should be done near the site of the production of the power, near the PV plants and near the wind turbines. So this sounds like a distraction to me.
Thank you. Oh, we have 2 minutes. I'm going to say thank you to all the panelists and wait, we have 2 questions and we have 2 minutes. So 1 minute for a Vivian question and 1 minute for the person standing. Vivian?
This was the third online question. How about pink hydrogen, using nuclear power in such areas as Japan and Korea? Is it better than blue?
Well, almost anything's better than blue. But, I'm not a big fan of nuclear power. When we have existing nuclear power plants and they're safe, I suppose it makes sense to keep operating them through their design period as long as they're not terribly subsidized to do that. But producing hydrogen out of that as opposed to using the electricity directly doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I think just from an economic point of view, you could add that new build nuclears are horrendously expensive. Globally, IEEFA has written about them a lot in the US context, but even globally, when you look in the UK and recent ones built in the UK, France, Finland, they've all been wildly over budget and wildly over time. And it's a very big problem being over time when you build a nuclear power plant, because generally speaking, they're big, which means you have a big hole to fill in your electricity system when they're delivered a decade late, which is pretty common for nuclear these days to be delivered, extremely late and extremely over budget. So, there's issues at the moment with just being able to build nukes at reasonable price.
We're going to do a 1 minute on the last question. Can we do that? Oh, you need to
really
do
quickly,
something?
just on
Okay.
nuclear. I mean, I think it's important to ask, why would a nuclear power plant want to produce hydrogen instead of selling electricity? And the only answer to that is that because they think they're going to make more money by selling the hydrogen, which means that the hydrogen is not going to be cheap.
Good point. One last
Thanks.
question.
Gabriel Kuiper, till recently with IEEFA Australia, here with a Smart Energy Council hat on. I feel like this is deja vu with clean coal back in the day, talking about sort of green gas. The panel has been incredibly compelling, so I'm wondering, given everything else we have to do in terms of renewables and in terms of electrification and in terms of efficiency and demand response, are there any policy or regulatory support that the panel would recommend for hydrogen, or are we best all to leave the room and focus on other things rather than looking at hydrogen full stop?
I think hydrogen is a huge distraction, quite frankly, largely. And so I think we should push forward with doing everything we can to produce renewable solar and wind as quickly as possible, and do so with smart demand management, and move to a renewable energy system where blue hydrogen, fossil fuels in general have no role, and we view green hydrogen as a precious, probably fairly expensive resource that might have a niche role in making steel, perhaps in long distance air transportation, things of that sort. But the fascination of our societies across the world now with hydrogen is it's a distraction, and it's because of the clear lobbying efforts of the oil and gas industry. Bait and switch. I don't think there's any question about that. So I think we should push back on it, but I don't think we should spend all of our time pushing back on it, because then we're losing our eye on what needs to really be the future.
Yeah, I do think the oil and gas industry, look, looping back to an earlier question, the oil and gas industry is still incredibly powerful politically. It gives very large political donations to candidates all around the globe. It's got a brilliant, well, particularly in Australia where I'm from, an absolutely brilliant PR organisation. They are the gold class in PR. And I think globally, pretty much the oil and gas industry is the gold class in PR. So, you know, really, we do have our work cut out to ensure that blue hydrogen doesn't become more than a distraction and doesn't actually embed itself in the energy system to the point where you end up with an energy system that is still methane dependent and very climate destructive. So I do see it as a big challenge. On the positive side, I think that the renewable energy industry is getting its act together in terms of actually doing some lobbying themselves and doing the things that the oil and gas industry does. They're getting better at it, because they were pretty hopeless for many years.
I think I want to say thank you to everyone here and to our wonderful, wonderful panel.